Hey guys, tonight let's do the sensible thing and gently lower our expectations of excitement. Dim the lights, scoot the phone just a little farther from your face, let your eyes do that half-closed thing where you can still hear words but you're not totally committed to understanding them. Because tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, specifically into the slow, smoky, extremely underseasoned world of preparing a medieval Christmas feast. Not the eating part yet, the preparing part, which honestly is where most of the suffering happened. Now, when we picture a medieval Christmas feast, we tend to imagine long wooden tables, roaring fires, piles of roasted meat, shiny goblets, maybe a lute player in the corner who's trying his best. It looks warm. It looks cozy. It looks like something out of a holiday card that smells faintly of pine and denial. But what it actually took to make that feast happen was weeks of planning, months of hoarding, and a truly heroic amount of standing around in cold rooms wondering why everything smelled like damp straw and boiled animal. So let's ease into it. First, we need to understand that Christmas in the medieval world wasn't just a nice dinner. It was the dinner, the big one. The meal your lord, your king, your abbot, or your extremely judgmental in-laws were absolutely going to remember. And if you messed it up, people noticed, quietly, forever. Preparation for a medieval Christmas feast didn't begin in December. It started much earlier, usually in late autumn, when everyone realized winter was coming and food was about to become a very emotional topic. This was a world without grocery stores, no emergency runs for butter, no realizing at 6 p.m. that you forgot the onions. If you forgot the onions, you simply lived without onions and thought about your mistake every time you chewed. So the first step in preparing a Christmas feast was storage. And by storage, we mean aggressively stockpiling anything that could survive long enough to still be recognizable by December 25th. Grain was counted. Salt was guarded like treasure. Dried peas sat quietly in sacks, waiting for their moment. And meat, which was the star of the show, had to be handled very carefully. Because fresh meat in winter was tricky. You couldn't just pop it in the fridge. You were the fridge. And the fridge was usually a drafty stone room that smelled like disappointment. Animals intended for Christmas were often slaughtered weeks ahead of time, not on Christmas morning. No one was doing that kind of last-minute chaos. Pigs were salted. Beef was dried. Venison, if you were fancy or illegally optimistic, was smoked or preserved in whatever way seemed least likely to result in everyone getting sick. Salt was everything. Salt kept food edible. Salt kept people alive. Salt also made food taste like salt, which was considered acceptable. And if you were wealthy, you might also have spices, real spices, imported spices, spices that had traveled farther than most people ever would. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. They were expensive, they were powerful, they were used sparingly and often incorrectly, but having them at Christmas was a flex. Sprinkling spice on your food was basically saying, I have global trade connections and you don't. Now, while the pantry was slowly filling up, the household staff was mentally preparing themselves for what was coming, because a medieval Christmas feast wasn't cooked by one stressed-out person alone in a kitchen. It was a coordinated effort involving cooks, scullions, servants, bakers, brewers, and at least one person whose entire job was just to turn things on a spit for hours. And yes, that was a real job. Imagine your resume reading, professional meat turner. 8-hour shifts, no benefits, lots of smoke. The kitchens themselves were not cozy. They were hot, loud, smoky, and permanently damp. The fire never really went out. It just glared at you constantly, like it knew you were tired. There were no precise measurements, no timers, no thermometers. Everything was done by feel, instinct, and experience. Is the bread done? Probably. Is the meat cooked? It stopped bleeding, so we're calling it cooked. And Christmas meant more of everything. More bread, more meat, more ale, more work. Bread alone was a major operation. In a noble household, hundreds of loaves might be baked in the days leading up to Christmas. Not fluffy bread, dense bread. Bread that could survive being dipped in stew repeatedly without dissolving into emotional paste. These loaves would be stacked, counted, and guarded. Bread was used as food, plates, and occasionally napkins. Nothing went to waste.
especially not at Christmas when guests were watching. Ale and wine were another concern. Beer was brewed constantly in medieval life, but Christmas demanded better beer, stronger beer, beer that said, yes, we planned for this. Wine, if available, was brought out sparingly and dramatically. Wine meant wealth. Wine meant connections. Wine meant someone was about to talk a little too loudly. Now, while all this was happening behind the scenes, the social pressure was quietly building. A Christmas feast wasn't just about feeding people. It was about hierarchy. Who sat where? Who got which cut of meat? Who received spices? Who received leftovers? Every detail reinforced the social order. The Lord received the best cuts. The honored guests got the next best. Everyone else worked their way down the animal, and everyone noticed. If you were served something unexpectedly good, you remembered it. If you were served something suspiciously chewy, you also remembered it. The cooks knew this, which is why Christmas cooking was slow, careful, and deeply stressful. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the kitchen was already exhausted. Roasts were turning, pots were simmering quietly, thick with breadcrumbs, wine, and optimism. Pies were especially important, not sweet pies usually, meat pies, heavily spiced meat pies sealed in thick pastry that acted more like a container than a treat. Some pies were decorative, some were symbolic, some were filled with birds, sometimes several birds, sometimes birds inside other birds because medieval cooks loved a theme. The famous cockentrice involved sewing the front half of a chicken to the back half of a pig. Why? Because they could, and because Christmas. This was not about taste, this was about spectacle, about reminding everyone that the household could afford to waste time on nonsense, and nonsense took time. The day before Christmas was mostly controlled chaos. Fires were stoked, knives were sharpened, servants ran back and forth carrying things that were hot, heavy, or both. Meanwhile, the lord of the house was probably not helping. He was planning seating arrangements, or praying, or both. He might inspect the kitchens briefly, nod gravely, and then leave before being asked to carry anything. By Christmas morning, the feast was already in motion. This is important to understand. The food didn't magically appear after church. It had been cooking all night. Roasts turned slowly, pots simmered quietly, bread was reheated, ale was poured. The kitchen staff had likely slept in shifts, if at all. They were running on habit and muscle memory, and possibly resentment. When the meal was finally ready to be served, it moved in waves. Platters carried out, set down, admired. Steam rising, fat glistening, herbs sprinkled carefully on top so everyone could see them. This was the moment all the preparation had been leading to. And if something went wrong, it went wrong quietly. A sauce too thin, a roast slightly dry, a pie that didn't quite hold together. No one screamed, no one threw plates. They simply remembered. And after the feast, when the guests were full and warm and drifting into conversation, the kitchen didn't rest. There were bones to clean, grease to scrape, dishes to wash in cold water, leftovers to store carefully so they might last a few more days. Christmas was one meal, but it echoed for weeks. And as the fire slowly burned down and the hall grew quiet, the cooks finally stopped moving. They had done it. Another Christmas survived.
The kitchen is still warm behind us, full of smoke and quiet resentment. But now we're moving into the great hall, the place where all that work finally landed, the place where the food was judged, silently, forever. The medieval Christmas feast wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, and the audience was seated according to how important they were, how related they were, or how dangerous they might become if insulted. The great hall itself was usually cold, even with the fire going. Stone walls, high ceilings, drafts that found you no matter how many layers you wore. But at Christmas, it was dressed up as best as possible. Evergreen branches hung from beams, holly was tucked into corners, candles flickered everywhere, doing their best against the darkness, and mostly just making shadows bigger. The table setup mattered a lot. At the head of the hall sat the Lord, maybe with his wife, maybe with an important guest, maybe alone if he was feeling dramatic. This was the high table, literally raised above everyone else, because Symbolism. The closer you sat to the high table, the better your food. The farther away you were, the more you adjusted your expectations. And Christmas was the one day of the year where people really paid attention to this, because Christmas feasts were about generosity, and generosity was very easy to measure in portions of meat. Now, when the food began to arrive, it didn't all come at once. Medieval feasts were served in courses, not courses like we think of them today, neatly separated and paced, more like waves of food appearing, disappearing, and being replaced by more food. The first course usually involved bread, pottage, and maybe something modest, a gentle warm-up, a reminder that yes, food was happening. Pottage, by the way, was everywhere, a thick stew made of grains, vegetables, maybe some meat if you were lucky. Everyone ate it, everyone pretended to like it. At Christmas, it might be a little richer, a little thicker, a little less depressing. Then came the roasts. This was the moment everyone waited for. Huge platters carried in by servants who had practiced not tripping, whole animals, or large recognizable sections of animals. Roast beef, pork, mutton, goose, swan if you were very wealthy and deeply committed to being extra. These roasts were meant to impress before they were meant to be eaten. They were displayed, admired, sometimes carved right there in front of everyone by someone who knew exactly how to cut without embarrassing himself. Carving was a skill, a respected one. There were manuals about it, guides explaining how to cut each animal properly, because cutting the wrong way was apparently a social crime. The best cuts went to the most important people. This was not subtle, it was intentional, and it was watched closely. If you were handed a prime slice, you felt seen. If you received something bony and questionable, you smiled politely and filed it away in your memory. Sauces were poured over meat, not so much to enhance flavor, but to show effort. Sauces were thick, spiced, and often sweet. Medieval tastes leaned heavily towards mixing flavors we would now politely separate. Meat with fruit, fish with cinnamon, wine and everything. At Christmas, sweetness was a luxury. Sugar existed, but it was expensive. Honey was more common, but still special, so sweet dishes mattered. Which brings us to subtleties. Subtleties were decorative dishes made from sugar paste, marzipan, or molded bread. They were shaped like castles, animals, saints, or abstract nonsense that no one fully understood. They weren't always meant to be eaten. Sometimes they just sat there, judging you. At Christmas, subtleties were used to tell stories, biblical scenes, family crests, symbols of power. They said, look what we can afford to make and not even consume. Meanwhile, the guests were eating with their hands. Forks existed, but they were suspicious, too foreign, too delicate. Knives and fingers did most of the work. Napkins were communal, sometimes non-existent. Bread was used to wipe hands, and then either eaten or tossed to the poor, which was another important part of a medieval Christmas feast, charity, or at least the appearance of it. Leftovers were distributed to servants or the poor, depending on the household. This wasn't just kindness, it was expected. A lord who didn't show generosity at Christmas was quietly judged. People talked, always quietly, but constantly. As the feast continued, drinks flowed more freely. Ale first, then wine. And with wine came stories, boasting, religious reflection, occasional emotional oversharing. Christmas feasts were long, hours long. There was no rush. No one had anywhere else to be. Music played, not continuously, but enough to remind everyone that entertainment existed. Minstrels sang, Someone played a harp or a lute. The songs were familiar, religious, seasonal. No one clapped. They nodded appreciatively. As the evening wore on, more dishes appeared: pies, custards, cheese, fruit if available, dried figs, dates, apples stored carefully since autumn. These were precious. They tasted faintly of the season they came from, of effort. By this point, everyone was full, uncomfortably so, which was the goal. A successful Christmas feast left people heavy, warm, and slightly dazed. And that was the point. This was a world where hunger was always nearby, where winter was long, where meals were often small and repetitive. So Christmas was the release, the reminder that abundance was possible, at least for one day. Eventually, the feast wound down, not with a clear ending, just a slow fading. People leaned back, conversations softened, some guests drifted away, others stayed near the fire. The tables were gradually cleared, quietly, efficiently, and as the hall emptied, the meaning of the feast lingered, because everyone would remember it. They would remember who was generous, who was stingy, who sat where, who received what. A medieval Christmas feast wasn't just about food, it was about memory, reputation, status. And somewhere back in the kitchen, the staff was cleaning up again. Hands cracked, clothes soaked with grease and smoke. They didn't get speeches, they didn't get subtleties, but they made the whole thing happen. And as the embers cooled and the candles burned low, the household settled into that rare medieval feeling of contentment, for one night at least.
We're heading somewhere quieter, smaller, colder. Because most people in the medieval world were not attending lavish Christmas feasts under high ceilings. They weren't ranking cuts of meat or judging sugar sculptures. They were peasants, craftspeople, laborers, people whose Christmas feast looked different. Still important, still meaningful, just significantly less dramatic. For ordinary medieval families, Christmas was one of the few times in the year when eating slightly better than usual was possible. Not extravagant, not indulgent, just better. And that mattered. Preparation for a peasant Christmas feast began the same way as everything else in peasant life, with careful planning and a quiet awareness that one bad decision could ruin the winter. Food was limited, very limited. Most families lived on bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables had survived storage. So Christmas meant saving something special. Maybe a chicken, maybe a small piece of pork, maybe extra butter or cheese that had been hidden away for weeks. These weren't impulse decisions, this was strategy. A family might decide in early December which animal would be sacrificed for Christmas. And yes, sacrifice feels like the right word. Chickens were valuable. They laid eggs. They were useful year-round, so killing one was a big deal. But Christmas was worth it, at least once. If a pig had been slaughtered earlier in the season, a better cut might be saved, salted, hung, guarded carefully. This wasn't food you casually snacked on. This was food with a calendar appointment. Bread for Christmas was better bread, whiter if possible, finer flour if available. Most people ate dark, coarse bread daily, but at Christmas, maybe you splurged, or traded, or begged a favor from the miller. White bread wasn't just tastier, it was symbolic. It felt festive.
Pottage, the eternal medieval staple, was also upgraded. More grains, more vegetables, maybe even some meat fat stirred in for flavor. Spices were rare for peasants, extremely rare. But herbs weren't. Onions, garlic, leeks, parsley, sage. These made appearances at Christmas, not because they were fancy, but because they were flavorful, and because you wanted the day to taste different. Ale was brewed specially for Christmas, if possible. Stronger than usual, darker, more filling. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was calories, it was warmth, it was a mild escape. For many households, Christmas ale was the highlight of the season. The day itself started early, very early. People went to church because that was non-negotiable. Christmas Mass was long, cold, and crowded, but it was also comforting. Candles, familiar hymns, the sense that everyone was doing the same thing at the same time. After church came the meal. This wasn't a feast that lasted all day, it was a single main meal, but it was bigger than usual. Families gathered. Sometimes neighbors joined in. Food was shared. The meat was cooked simply, roasted or boiled. No elaborate sauces, no spectacle. But it was meat, and that alone made it special. People ate slowly, not because they were savoring every bite in a dramatic way, but because food like this didn't come often. Children noticed the difference immediately. They always did. Adults pretended not to be emotional about it. Dessert, if it existed, was modest. Maybe dried fruit, maybe honey-sweetened bread, maybe a simple custard if eggs were available. Nothing elaborate, nothing showy. But it was sweet, and sweetness meant celebration. After eating, there was time, which was unusual. No field work, no heavy labor, just rest. People talked, sang, played simple games. Stories were told, old ones, familiar ones. This was the kind of Christmas that didn't leave written records. No menus, no guest lists, no chroniclers noting how many courses were served. But it mattered just as much. Because for ordinary people, Christmas wasn't about displaying wealth. It was about breaking routine. It was about remembering that life wasn't only work and survival, that there was room for warmth, for community. And that feeling lingered. Even after the leftovers were gone, even after the better bread was finished, even after the ale ran out. Now, it's worth noting that Christmas celebrations varied by region, by climate, by local tradition. In some places, fish played a larger role, in others, dairy. In colder regions, preserved foods dominated. But the core idea stayed the same. Christmas was when you ate better than usual, even if better was relative. And just like in noble households, memory mattered. People remembered who shared, who didn't, who opened their door, who kept their food to themselves. Christmas generosity wasn't enforced by law, it was enforced by reputation. Now, while peasants celebrated in their homes, monasteries and convents were having their own version of Christmas feasting, and it was complicated. Monastic rules usually emphasized restraint, simplicity, fasting. But Christmas was an exception. Even the strictest orders relaxed the rules slightly. Meat might be allowed, wine might be served more freely. Monks ate together in silence most days, but on Christmas there might be readings, special prayers, a sense that this meal was different. Still restrained, still quiet, but richer. The food wasn't extravagant, but it was plentiful, and for many monks this was as close as they got to indulgence. Across all social classes, Christmas food carried meaning far beyond nutrition. It was about survival, status, faith, community. And preparing it, whether in a castle kitchen or a one-room cottage, was an act of hope. Hope that the winter would pass, that the stores would last, that the next year would be manageable. So, when we talk about medieval Christmas feasts, we're really talking about preparation in every sense. Preparing food, preparing relationships, preparing for the long stretch of winter ahead. And as the candles burned down across Europe, some in great halls, some in humble homes, the same quiet feeling settled everywhere. A pause, a breath, and then, inevitably, the return to normal life. But before that happens, before the tables are cleared for good,
Let's slow things down even more now. The hall is quiet. The benches are empty. The fire has burned down to a low, steady glow that isn't trying to impress anyone anymore. This is the part no one painted. The aftermath. The long, unglamorous stretch after Christmas, when the feast was over, but winter was very much still happening. In medieval life, Christmas wasn't an ending. It was a brief interruption. The work resumed almost immediately. In wealthy households, the morning after Christmas was about inventory, what was left, what had been used, what needed to be rationed carefully until spring. Bones were collected, not thrown away, never thrown away. They were boiled again, and sometimes again. Broths were made, thin but nourishing. The flavor of Christmas stretched as far as it could go. Fat was scraped from roasting pans and stored, rendered, saved. Fat meant calories. Fat meant warmth. Fat meant survival. Bread that had gone stale wasn't wasted. It was soaked, fried, added to stews. Leftover pies were cut into smaller pieces and reheated slowly, very slowly, because the goal now was not indulgence, it was endurance. Servants and cooks, who had been running on adrenaline for days, finally felt the weight of exhaustion. Hands cracked from cold water, muscles sore from lifting and standing. There was no applause, no thanks, just the understanding that the feast had happened, and that was enough. In peasant homes, the shift was even sharper. The good bread was gone, the special meat had been eaten, the ale barrels were lighter. The next meals were smaller, plainer, but there was a quiet satisfaction there, because Christmas had happened, it had been marked, and that mattered. People talked about it in the weeks that followed, not loudly, not dramatically, just small comments. That was a good chicken this year. The bread held up well. The ale was stronger than last winter. These were compliments, real ones. In a world without photographs, without recordings, memory did all the work, and food was one of the strongest anchors memory had. A well-prepared Christmas meal stayed with people, not as spectacle, but as reassurance. Winter was long. January and February were brutal.
Food stores dwindled. Illness spread easily. Cold settled into bones and refused to leave. So people fought back to Christmas. They remembered warmth. They remembered fullness. They remembered sitting together. And that memory helped. Now, it's worth noting that medieval Christmas didn't end on December 25th. Not really. The season stretched on, 12 days traditionally. Each day had its own small observances, small meals, small treats if any remained. Twelfth night marked the official end of Christmas. By then, most households were already deep back into routine. But the season lingered emotionally, especially in the kitchen, because the kitchen remembered everything. The smells, the mess, the patterns. Cooks learned from each Christmas what worked, what didn't. Too much spice, not enough salt, a pie crust that cracked too easily. These lessons were passed down, quietly, practically. Medieval cooking wasn't written down for the most part. It lived in hands, in habits. A Christmas feast wasn't recreated from a recipe. It was recreated from memory. And every year it changed slightly, based on harvests, on trade, on weather, on who was still alive. Because that's another thing Christmas preparation revealed. Absence. Someone who had been there last year, but not this year. A seat empty, a portion redistributed. Life was fragile, and Christmas, for all its warmth, didn't hide that. It acknowledged it quietly, by gathering, by eating, by continuing. In noble households, Christmas also reinforced power. A successful feast showed control over resources, over people, over time. A lord who could feed many through winter looked strong, reliable. That mattered. Political alliances were shaped around tables. Promises made over food felt heavier, more real. Christmas was a reminder that authority wasn't just enforced by force. It was reinforced by hospitality. Feed people well, and they remember it. In monasteries, Christmas leftovers were handled with particular care. Nothing wasted, everything accounted for. Monks returned to their regular diets, but with a lingering sense of having been allowed something special. A brief softening of rules, which made the return to restraint feel manageable. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. Prepare, feast, endure. And at the center of it all was the act of preparation. Because medieval people didn't experience Christmas as a single day, they experienced it as a process. Weeks of planning, days of labor, hours of eating, months of remembering. And that rhythm shaped how Christmas felt. Not rushed, not commercial, not overwhelming, just important. So when we imagine medieval Christmas feasts, it's tempting to focus on the tables, the roasts, the spectacle. But the real story lives behind the scenes, in the storage rooms, in the kitchens, in the careful decisions made long before December. It lives in the quiet understanding that this meal mattered because it was hard to make. Because nothing about medieval life was easy, especially not feeding people in winter. And as the last traces of Christmas faded, people looked ahead to more cold days, to more careful meals, to the slow return of light. But they carried Christmas with them, in memory, in habit, in hope. And that, more than any feast, was the true purpose of a medieval Christmas meal. Now, as we let that feeling settle, as the fire dims just a bit more,
Let's not rush away just yet. The fire is still warm enough to sit beside. The winter night outside is doing what winter nights do. And medieval Christmas, as it turns out, had a lot of soft traditions that hovered around the feast itself. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just small habits that made the season feel different. Because even in a world that rarely slowed down, people noticed when a day felt set apart. One of the first things to understand is that medieval Christmas wasn't obsessed with novelty. It didn't chase new experiences. It leaned into familiarity. People wanted things to feel the same as last year and the year before that, because sameness meant stability. So many Christmas food traditions repeated themselves. The same dishes, the same methods, the same order. Not because people lacked imagination, but because repetition was comforting. If your grandmother made a certain kind of bread at Christmas, you made it too. If your household always roasted a goose, you kept roasting the goose. Changing things too much felt risky. Food carried memory, and memory mattered. In many regions, certain foods were associated specifically with Christmas, not because they tasted better then, but because they belonged to that moment. In England, mince pies began their slow evolution from actual meat pies into something sweeter. Early versions were filled with chopped meat, dried fruit, spices, and fat. Heavy, dense, filling. They were meant to last. They were meant to sustain. In parts of Europe, special Christmas breads were baked, rich with eggs and butter if possible, marked with crosses, sometimes shaped differently than everyday loaves. These breads weren't just food, they were symbols. Breaking the bread at Christmas carried religious meaning, but also social meaning. It marked the moment when restraint loosened, when you allowed yourself something extra. In some places, a portion of Christmas bread or cake was saved, not eaten immediately. It might be kept for days, weeks. Sometimes it was believed to protect the household, or bring luck, or simply remind people that Christmas had happened. Superstition lived comfortably alongside faith in the medieval world, and food was often where they met. Bones from the Christmas meal might be buried, or kept, or treated differently than ordinary scraps. Not because people were strange, but because Christmas made everything feel a little more significant. Even cleaning up carried ritual weight. The kitchen after Christmas wasn't just cleaned, it was reset. Fires were banked differently, tools were stored carefully, because the feast had been a disruption, and now order needed to return. In some households, servants received small gifts after the feast, extra food, clothing, coins. Not generous by modern standards, but meaningful. Because Christmas was one of the few times social hierarchies softened slightly, just slightly. Masters showed appreciation, servants felt acknowledged, and then, quietly, everything snapped back into place. Children experienced Christmas differently. For them, the feast wasn't about status or memory, it was about fullness, about seeing more food at once than usual, about tastes that didn't appear every day. They remembered sweetness,
fat, warmth. Those memories stayed with them long after they forgot the details. Adults remembered logistics, effort, risk. Both experiences existed side by side, and that's what made Christmas feel layered. Another quiet tradition was hospitality. Christmas was a time when travelers might be welcomed more readily. Not always, not everywhere, but turning someone away on Christmas carried a particular weight. Inns served better food if they could. Homes opened their doors when possible. This wasn't universal kindness. It was conditional, limited, but it mattered. Because Christmas framed generosity as a virtue, even in a harsh world. Now, not every medieval Christmas was warm and successful. Bad harvests happened, wars happened, plagues happened. Some years, Christmas was thin, quiet, somber. But even then, people tried. Even the small change, a slightly better pot of pottage, a candle lit longer than usual, was enough to mark the day. Because marking the day mattered more than abundance. And this is where modern expectations often miss the point. Medieval Christmas wasn't magical because it was lavish. It was meaningful because it was intentional. Every extra bite represented planning. Every shared dish represented trust. And every feast, large or small, was built on preparation. Preparation that started months earlier and echoed months later. The calendar mattered too. Christmas fell near the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. People felt that deeply. Long nights, short days. The feast wasn't just about religion, it was about light returning, slowly, reluctantly. Food helped people feel that shift. Heavy meals made nights easier to bear. Shared tables made darkness feel less isolating. And as days lengthened, even slightly, people noticed. They always did. By the time January settled in, Christmas felt distant but present. The memory lingered in habits, in expectations. People looked ahead to Candlemas, to Easter, to the next moment when the calendar would offer something different. But Christmas stayed special, because it asked for more effort than any other meal and rewarded it with warmth. So when we imagine medieval people sitting down to Christmas dinner, it's worth slowing our own expectations. This wasn't a cinematic moment. It wasn't loud. It was steady, grounded. It smelled like smoke and bread. It sounded like quiet conversation and clinking cups. It felt like relief. And after it passed, life went on. Fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, bread needed baking. But something had shifted, just slightly. People had paused. They had eaten together. They had remembered what mattered. And that pause was enough to carry them forward. So as we gently bring this part of the story to rest, as the fire settles into embers, we can hold on to that feeling.
Let's keep floating. No sudden movements. The house is quiet now. The night has settled into that deep winter stillness where even sounds feel tired. Because one of the strangest things about medieval Christmas is not how loud it was, but how long it lasted in people's minds. In a world without calendars on walls, without notifications or countdowns, time was felt differently. Events didn't blur together, they stood out. And Christmas stood out more than most. People marked time by meals, by harvests, by feasts. So when someone thought back on a year, they didn't say last December. They said after Christmas or before the feast. That's how important it was. The memory of Christmas food lingered in conversation long after the plates were empty, especially in villages. Someone would mention how the goose turned out this year, or how the bread was lighter than usual, or how the ale went faster than expected, which everyone pretended not to notice. These weren't complaints, they were markers. They helped people locate themselves in time. In noble households, Christmas feasts entered records. Accounts listed purchases, spices bought, animals slaughtered. Stewards kept track of everything, not because they loved paperwork, but because Christmas was expensive, and expense mattered. A lavish feast signaled stability. A modest one raised eyebrows. Lords knew this, which is why even in lean years they tried to maintain appearances. Better to borrow, better to stretch resources, better to quietly reduce portions than to cancel tradition entirely. Because canceling Christmas was unthinkable. It would have felt like admitting failure. So preparation continued, year after year, adjusted, adapted. This consistency created tradition, and tradition created comfort. Now let's talk briefly about expectations. By the late medieval period, people expected Christmas to include certain foods, not because they were written into law, but because memory had made them feel essential. Meat, better bread, ale, or wine. If one of those was missing, Christmas felt incomplete, and people noticed. This expectation put pressure on households, especially poorer ones. But instead of abandoning the effort, families improvised. They made smaller versions, substitutes. If there was no meat, maybe extra cheese. If no ale, maybe warm spice of water or thin beer. The goal wasn't perfection, it was participation. Everyone wanted to feel like Christmas had happened to them too. And this collective participation is what made Christmas powerful. It wasn't confined to castles. It wasn't owned by the wealthy. It was shared across classes, even if the experiences looked very different. The feast in a great hall and the meal in a cottage were connected by intention. Both required planning, both required sacrifice, and both carried meaning far beyond the food itself. This is why medieval Christmas endured even through chaos. Wars interrupted harvests, plagues wiped out communities, but when possible, people still tried to mark Christmas, even quietly, even with very little. Because in a world that offered few guarantees, tradition was a form of stability. Preparing a Christmas meal, any Christmas meal, was a way of asserting continuity. It said, "We are still here. We are still human. We still gather." And that mattered more than abundance. Now, as we reach the end of this slow journey, it's worth noticing how gentle medieval Christmas actually was. No countdowns, no frantic shopping, no pressure to be cheerful. Just preparation, then eating, then remembering. The pace was slow because it had to be. Food took time. Fire took time. Winter demanded patience. And patience shaped the experience. People didn't rush through Christmas. They let it unfold.
They let the feast linger. They let the season stretch. And when it ended, they accepted it. No disappointment, no desperate clinging, just a return to routine, carrying the warmth forward. So when we think about what it was like to prepare a medieval Christmas feast, the answer isn't just about food, it's about mindset. It was about planning ahead, about working together, about trusting that effort would pay off. It was about finding meaning in repetition, comfort in familiarity, and about letting one good meal carry you through many hard days, which honestly is a lesson that still works. So now, as the fire finally fades, as the winter night settles fully around us, we can let the medieval world drift away. The kitchens grow cold, the halls fall silent, the memories remain. And for tonight, that's enough.
Let's stay just a little longer. Because medieval Christmas feasts, for all their planning and intention, did not always go perfectly. And the interesting part is how calmly people accepted that. This was not a culture that expected perfection. It expected effort. So when things went wrong, they were absorbed quietly into the experience, smoothed over, explained away. And things did go wrong, all the time. A roast could overcook, a pie could split open and leak its contents into the fire. Ale could turn sour at exactly the wrong moment, and there was no backup plan. If the goose burned, the goose burned. If the bread was dense enough to qualify as building material, then everyone chewed thoughtfully and said nothing. Because complaining about Christmas food was bad form, very bad form, especially in noble households. Guests were expected to praise the feast, regardless of reality, even if the meat was dry, even if the sauce was aggressively spiced to the point of confusion. You nodded, you smiled, you complimented the effort. Because the feast was a gift, and gifts were not critiqued. Behind the scenes, of course, people noticed. Stewards noted failures. Cooks adjusted next year's plans. But outwardly, everything was most excellent. In peasant households, mistakes were handled even more quietly. If a dish didn't turn out, there was no replacement, no apology. People simply ate it anyway. Because food was food. And Christmas food, even flawed, was still better than most meals. Sometimes things went wrong before the feast even began. A preserved piece of meat might spoil unexpectedly. A storage sack might attract rodents. A barrel of ale might leak. These were small disasters. They didn't ruin Christmas entirely, but they reshaped it. A family might decide to serve smaller portions, or remove a dish entirely. Children noticed. Adults pretended not to. And still, the day was marked. That's the important part. Christmas did not require abundance to exist. It required acknowledgement. Now, let's talk briefly about weather. Winter weather could disrupt everything. Snow blocked roads. Ice delayed deliveries. Cold made fires temperamental. A feast planned carefully could be altered by something as simple as a storm.
In noble households, this meant fewer guests arrived, which could be awkward or convenient. In villages, it might mean people stayed home, celebrating quietly instead of together. And no one thought this was strange. Weather was part of life. You adapted. You didn't fight it. And that adaptability is what kept Christmas resilient. Another quiet issue was timing. Medieval cooking took time, and sometimes it took more time than expected. A roast might not be ready when Mass ended. Bread might need longer in the oven. So people waited. They talked. They warmed themselves. There was no sense of being late. Time was flexible, and flexibility reduced stress. Imagine that. Even religious observance played into this calm. Christmas was sacred, yes, but it wasn't rushed. There was room for imperfection, for pauses, for silence. This gentleness extended to behavior at the table. If someone spilled a drink, it was cleaned up, quietly. If someone ate too much, no one commented. If someone drank too much, well, that was Christmas. Children were tolerated more. Mistakes were forgiven more easily. Because the feast wasn't about control. It was about continuity. And continuity allowed for flaws. Now, occasionally, something went wrong in a bigger way. A feud resurfaced. An argument sparked. A guest insulted another guest. Christmas did not magically fix human nature, but even then there was pressure to keep things calm. Disputes were postponed. Anger was swallowed. Because Christmas demanded peace, at least on the surface. That expectation mattered. It created a pause in conflict, even if only temporarily. And sometimes that pause was enough to prevent things from escalating. Now, as we stretch toward the very end of this long, quiet night, it's worth noticing how different this approach feels from modern expectations. Modern holidays often demand perfection. Perfect food, perfect timing, perfect feelings. Medieval Christmas demanded participation. Show up, prepare something, mark the day. That was enough. And because expectations were lower, satisfaction was easier. People didn't compare their feast to anyone else's. Not really. They compared it to last year, to memory. Was it better? Worse? About the same. That was the scale. And most years, about the same was a success. So when we imagine medieval people preparing Christmas food, it's important to let go of spectacle. This wasn't a performance for an audience, it was a ritual for survival. And rituals don't need perfection. They need repetition. So now, as the fire finally goes dark, as the winter night claims everything fully, we can let the last details fade. The burnt edges, the thin sauce, the dense bread. None of that mattered in the end. What mattered was that people gathered. They ate. They remembered. And then they carried on.
let's stay in this slow drift a little longer. We've talked about kitchens and feasts, about mistakes and memory, about lords and peasants alike. But there's one more thing to notice before we fully leave the medieval Christmas behind: the rhythm. Because medieval Christmas wasn't just a day, it was a cadence, a gentle pulse in an otherwise relentless year. It moved through weeks of preparation, a single day of feasting, and then the quiet aftermath that stretched until Candlemas. This rhythm mattered. Daily life in the Middle Ages was exhausting. Work was unending. Fields needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Bread needed baking. Firewood needed chopping. And yet, Christmas forced a pause. Even if it was small, even if it was imperfect, even if it was cold and drafty, people marked the time differently during this season. Hours were counted not only by work, but by light, by meals, by the act of preparing something special. The chopping, the boiling, the turning of the spit, the kneading of dough, all of it carried a quiet meaning. Every action contributed to the whole. Every detail mattered because of intention, not perfection. Children noticed the rhythm most vividly. They might wake to the smell of bread before dawn, the gentle hum of a fire, the clatter of pots and pans. They understood instinctively that something was different, that today was set apart. Adults experienced it differently. Their attention was on logistics, on planning, on making sure the day would be marked properly. And yet, amidst the smoke and the stress, there was a subtle reward, the comfort of tradition, the reassurance that this moment would pass and life would continue, and that it was okay. Even the preparation itself was soothing in a strange way. It gave structure to a harsh winter. It gave purpose to labor. It gave hope that warmth, light, and abundance, even briefly, were possible. And then came the feast. Quiet, measured, and deliberate. Not chaotic, not spectacular by modern standards, but satisfying. Every bite reminded people that effort mattered. Every shared portion reminded them that community mattered. Every cup of ale or wine reminded them that celebration, even restrained, mattered. And when the last crumbs were gone, when the fire faded and the hall fell silent, life returned to its usual pace. Work resumed. Winter pressed in. The challenges of survival remained. But something lingered. Memory, tradition, the knowledge that even in the bleakest days a pause was possible, that people could gather, that food could be prepared with care, that warmth, however temporary, could exist. And that's what medieval Christmas ultimately represents. Not extravagance, not spectacle, not perfection, but continuity, connection, the slow, steady acknowledgement that life goes on, and that sometimes the best we can do is mark the moment, share what we have, and then carry the feeling forward. So, as we finally drift away from kitchens and halls, from peasants' cottages and noble estates, from the burnt edges and dense breads, let's take a moment to appreciate that. The feast may end, the fires may die down, the ale may run out, but the rhythm remains. The quiet rhythm of medieval life, marked, however briefly, by Christmas. And with that, we can rest. Let the night settle fully. Let the memory of smoke, bread, and spiced pottage drift gently through the mind, and sleep slowly, comfortably, and with the sense that even centuries ago, people found ways to mark the passing of time, to care for each other, and to celebrate the little warmths they could. All right, let's linger a little longer in this slow, quiet drift. The fire has cooled completely now. The snow outside, if there is any, muffles sound. The world is still. And in that stillness, we can notice something that often gets overlooked: what Christmas left behind in daily life. Because a medieval Christmas feast didn't just vanish once the dishes were cleared. It rippled outward, in small, almost imperceptible ways, in the rhythm of work, in the mood of households, in the very way people organized their days. For one, leftovers shaped weeks of meals afterward. Bones from the feast were boiled down for broth. Meat scraps were stretched carefully into stews and potages. Bread that had hardened became crumbs or was soaked in liquid to make it palatable again. Even the smallest remnants had purpose. Nothing was wasted. Everything carried memory. Children remembered the tastes, even when what they ate afterward was far simpler, far plainer. Those flavors lingered in imagination. They might recall the sweetness of honeyed bread, the richness of meat, the warmth of ale. These memories became part of how they understood comfort, warmth, and the rhythm of the year. Adults carried the feast differently. They remembered the work it took, the coordination of cooks, servants, and stewards, the careful preservation of food. They noted what worked and what didn't, and that knowledge shaped the next year's Christmas preparation. In noble households, Christmas also reinforced hierarchy long after the last plate was cleared. The positioning of seats, the distribution of meat, the allocation of leftovers, all of it mattered socially. It was remembered. Gossip carried it. The quiet judgments of who had received what lingered. And lords understood that their ability to host well affected more than just immediate comfort. It affected their reputation. Meanwhile, the act of preparation itself subtly influenced everyday life. Kitchens remained organized differently after Christmas. Supplies were monitored more closely. Spices, salt, flour, and ale were counted carefully. If something had gone wrong during the feast, adjustments were made quietly, almost ritualistically. Even the mundane chores of winter were touched by the memory of the feast. Stoking fires felt easier after having experienced the warmth of a full hall. Baking bread for ordinary meals felt slightly more comforting after the rhythm of preparation and feasting. Everyday life had absorbed the pause of Christmas and carried it forward. Religious observances, too, were subtly shaped. Masses and prayers during the 12 days of Christmas reflected the same idea: pause, acknowledge, participate, and then resume life. Even for those devoted to strict fasting and daily routines, the season allowed small exceptions, gentle indulgences, and moments of quiet joy. Now, let's drift toward another quiet detail: the decorations.
Evergreen branches, holly, ivy, and candles weren't just for show. They subtly influenced how people experienced winter. Stone halls and cottages were dark and cold for months at a time. A few green branches over the doorway or hanging from a beam reminded people that life persisted, that growth was possible, that light, however flickering, still existed. Candles were especially important. They were expensive. They burned slowly. They cast long shadows that moved with the fire. And in that movement, people felt a subtle rhythm of night giving way to day, of effort giving way to reward, of winter eventually ending. In smaller homes, decorations were simpler but no less meaningful. Perhaps a branch from a tree outside hung over a doorway, a candle in the window, a small symbol that the household had marked the season. This wasn't vanity, it was acknowledgement. It was participation in the rhythm of the world beyond the walls. And finally, even the social structure of feasting left echoes. Guests and neighbors carried stories forward. What did you eat? How was the bread? Who got the turkey? Stories became memory. Memory became tradition, and tradition shaped expectations for the next year. So while the physical feast might be gone, its impact lingered. In kitchens, in halls, in homes, in conversations, in habits, in memory. The rhythm of preparation, feasting, and reflection subtly guided life through the rest of winter. And in that slow, lingering influence, medieval Christmas became something more than a day. It became a heartbeat, a rhythm in an otherwise harsh, demanding world. Now, as we drift even closer to the very end of our journey through medieval Christmas, we can notice one last quiet, almost invisible part of the feast, and that was emotional residue. After all the preparation, all the feasting, all the cleaning up, there was something left that was less tangible than bread or ale, less tangible than roasted meat or preserved pies, and that was emotional residue. People carried it for weeks afterward. For the wealthy, it was a sense of accomplishment. They had fed a hall full of guests. They had reinforced their social position. They had displayed generosity, skill, and care. For servants, it was quiet pride or quiet exhaustion. They had worked tirelessly to make the day happen, and even without thanks, there was satisfaction in a job completed, a ritual maintained, a tradition upheld. For peasants, it was comfort. Even if small, even if fleeting, there was warmth. Even if the ale was thin, even if the bread was coarse, the day had been marked, and that gave hope. Children remembered joy, a rare moment of sweetness and fullness that lingered. They remembered it, savored it in memory, and repeated it in story. Even mistakes left residue. Burnt roasts, spilled ale, overcooked pies, they became anecdotes, quiet lessons, stories that reminded people to prepare differently next year, to coordinate more carefully, to pay attention. And in all of this, there was continuity, a sense that no matter how harsh winter might be, no matter how thin supplies, no matter how weary life became, Christmas would come again. This emotional residue shaped the very way people approached the year. It carried them through cold months. It helped them endure scarcity. It reminded them that warmth and care were possible, even if only briefly. And in that slow, lingering way, medieval Christmas did exactly what it was meant to do. It sustained people emotionally, socially, and spiritually. It provided a pause in an otherwise unrelenting world. It left memories that were carried forward quietly, intimately, and persistently. So, as we finally let the medieval Christmas world settle fully, as the last embers cool, and as silence drifts through stone halls and small cottages alike, it's worth noticing one last thing. Christmas in the Middle Ages wasn't about grandeur. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't even about food, really. It was about marking time, acknowledging effort, creating connection, carrying warmth through a long, dark winter. And maybe, if we close our eyes and breathe slowly, we can let a little of that calm, deliberate, quietly persistent feeling settle in for ourselves. Because even centuries later, the rhythm remains. Preparation, feast, memory, continuity. And with that, we can rest. The fire is out, the halls are quiet, the snow outside is still. And medieval Christmas, in all its gentle, smoky, spiced, and surprisingly patient glory, drifts softly into memory.
Let's drift a little further into the quiet folds of medieval life. We've lingered in kitchens, feasting halls, and cottages. We've followed the smells, the conversations, the smoke, and the memories. Now it's time to look at the lingering influence of Christmas long after the last crumb has been eaten and the final candle has burned down. Because in the Middle Ages, Christmas wasn't just a moment, it was a marker, a gentle pulse that shaped the months that followed. For starters, leftovers often determined meals for weeks. Bones were boiled again and again. Broths simmered slowly over low fires, giving warmth and sustenance. Meat scraps were stretched into pottages, soups, or mixed into bread dough. Even a small portion of preserved food carried people through late winter when supplies were thin and the land slept beneath frost and snow. The memory of what had been prepared also shaped expectations. Families knew what better food felt like. They compared every day's meal afterward to that single moment of Christmas abundance. A plain slice of bread in January was eaten in the context of what had been possible weeks earlier. Even when winter was hard, people carried a quiet reminder that they had once eaten well, and that this too was temporary. In noble households, Christmas helped reinforce household routines. The organizational skills and coordination required for a successful feast were lessons that lingered. Stewards refined their record-keeping,
Servants refined their timing, and cooks refined their methods. By Easter, those skills were quietly applied to daily meals, special visitors, and other minor celebrations. Even in smaller homes, the echoes of Christmas shaped behavior. People planned ahead more carefully for the rest of winter. Preservation techniques improved. Clever use of stores became second nature. The pause of Christmas offered perspective. It reminded people that scarcity could be managed and that small luxuries, when carefully planned, were possible. Religious observance was subtly influenced as well. The 12 days of Christmas carried a reflective tone. Even after the main feast, people continued to mark the season with minor celebrations, prayers, and community gatherings. These days were quieter than the big feast, but they carried the same rhythm: preparation, participation, memory. It taught patience, endurance, and a sense of continuity. There was also an element of social memory. Neighbors and families shared stories about the feast: who had received the largest portion of meat, who had baked the lightest bread, who had spilled the ale. These stories became part of the oral fabric of the community. They shaped reputation and reinforced connection. Even small moments like a perfectly baked pie or a slightly overcooked goose became communal knowledge, repeated quietly in conversations throughout the year. Children in particular carried Christmas forward in their memories. They anticipated next year's feast. They recounted last year's flavors. They compared their experiences to their siblings, neighbors, or friends. Through memory, the lesson of planning, patience, and ritual was passed to the next generation. And let's not forget the emotional aspect. Christmas left warmth long after the fires went out. Even when resources dwindled, the memory of a full table, shared laughter, quiet candlelight, and the smell of roasting meat carried people through bleak months. It was subtle, almost invisible, but powerful. In many ways, this lingering influence is what makes medieval Christmas remarkable. It wasn't the spectacle, it wasn't the roasts, the pies, or even the ale. It was the quiet ways the feast shaped thinking, habits, and community life. Even customs that seem small today, like saving a slice of bread for luck, or keeping a candle burning on a particular day, have roots in this period. They were subtle extensions of Christmas preparation and feasting, ways to stretch meaning beyond the moment. Every ritual, every small habit echoed the rhythm of preparation, indulgence, reflection, and endurance. And in that sense, Christmas never truly ended. It flowed quietly into January, into February, into spring planting, summer harvesting, and autumn gathering. Its lessons and rhythms were stitched into the fabric of life. Reminders of effort, memory, and community persisted through every season. So, as we finally drift toward the true conclusion of this slow, sleepy journey through medieval Christmas, it's worth reflecting on one final thought. Medieval people lived in a world of scarcity, cold, and endless labor. Yet they created moments of pause, of abundance, of warmth. They marked the dark season with light, food, and ritual. They celebrated not for spectacle, but for continuity. They prepared, they feasted, and they remembered. And those small, deliberate acts carried them forward through months of cold, hardship, and repetition. Even the smallest village cottages, the simplest tables, and the quietest kitchens were part of the rhythm of the season. No matter the class, no matter the resources, people participated in the gentle, persistent cadence of the season. And that is the quiet magic of medieval Christmas. Not in fireworks, fanfare, or grand display, but in the careful, patient, and surprisingly thoughtful ways humans marked time, nourished each other, and carried memory forward. So, at last, we can let the world fully rest. The halls are silent, the kitchens are cold, the snow outside is still, and the medieval Christmas, in all its smoky, spiced, and deliberate glory, drifts gently into memory. Sleep slowly, breathe gently, and let the quiet rhythm of centuries-old feasts lull you fully into rest.
Let's settle into the very final layer of this slow, gentle journey. The fire has long since become embers. The cold night beyond the walls is quiet and still, and all that remains is the echo, the lingering presence of medieval Christmas. Because what makes these feasts truly remarkable isn't just the food or the candles or even the preparation. It's the human rhythm behind them. The small, deliberate choices that mark time and memory in a world that doesn't pause for anyone. Think of the kitchens again. Not the grand halls with roaring fires and polished silver. The humble spaces where preparation took patience and effort, where bread was kneaded slowly, dough folded and rested, where meat was salted, hung, boiled, roasted, carefully, methodically, with a knowledge of winter scarcity pressing against every decision. Those kitchens were full of quiet heroes, people whose labor didn't make the chronicles, who weren't painted in portraits, but who kept tradition alive, who made warmth possible, who made memory tangible. And for a moment, imagine the sounds there. The soft scraping of a knife on a cutting board, the low hiss of fat in a pan, the faint crackle of a small hearth, the rhythmic tap of bread being kneaded, all of it forming a slow, steady music, the music of preparation, of ritual, of life pressing gently against the cold. Then came the feasts themselves, quiet, deliberate, and satisfying. Meat eaten slowly, in portions measured by care and practicality. Bread that was slightly richer than usual, breaking in warm, dense chunks. Ale that carried warmth more than intoxication. Conversations that were soft, measured, and calm.
Even the mistakes, burnt edges, spilled ale, slightly overcooked pies, were absorbed. They were part of the rhythm. They were quietly noted, remembered for next year, and then released. Afterward, the quiet reflection began, the careful cleaning of tools, the preservation of leftovers, the shifting of knowledge into habit, the passing of lessons from one generation to the next. And that's where the true magic of medieval Christmas existed, not in spectacle, but in continuity. The feast carried memory, it carried community, it carried hope, and it carried the simple, essential knowledge that the world, harsh as it could be, could offer moments of pause and warmth. In noble households, the echoes were social and political. The success or failure of a feast could ripple through reputation, alliances, and hierarchy. In humble cottages, the echoes were practical and emotional. The memory of a slightly better meal, a warmer night, a shared candlelight carried people through long months of scarcity. Even the natural world participated quietly. Evergreen branches, holly, ivy, they marked the presence of life during the darkest months. Candles flickered softly, casting long shadows that reminded people of the passage of time. And outside, snow muffled sound, creating a calm that made the indoors feel warmer, safer, more significant. And the greatest lesson of all, that this pause, this effort, this rhythm was enough. Not abundance, not perfection, not spectacle. Enough. Enough to sustain memory, enough to sustain hope, enough to sustain human connection. Even after the feast was gone, even after the fire cooled completely, the rhythm persisted. It shaped the rest of winter. It shaped the everyday. It shaped human understanding of time, care, and continuity. So as we finally settle into the last quiet notes of this journey, let's imagine one final time the medieval world at Christmas. A small village cottage, smoke curling softly from the chimney, bread resting on the table, slightly warm, a small roasted bird, just enough to feed the family, its aroma lingering. Candles flickering, casting shadows against the walls. A quiet sense of accomplishment, connection, and warmth. A noble hall, long tables arranged carefully, roasts glistening, ale flowing, laughter subdued but present, guests seated in calm rhythm, acknowledging the feast without spectacle, feeling both comfort and continuity. And across the land, from cottages to castles, from monasteries to market towns, the same gentle pulse, preparation, feast, memory, pause, reflection, continuation. The essence of medieval Christmas wasn't in a single moment or a single meal. It was in this quiet, persistent pattern. And if we close our eyes, breathe slowly, and let ourselves drift along the rhythm, we can feel it too. Preparation, feast, memory, endurance, continuity. The fire fades, the snow muffles the world, and for a final time we let the medieval Christmas settle into memory, drifting softly across centuries. Sleep now, slowly, and let the gentle, smoky, spiced, and deliberate world of medieval Christmas lull you completely into rest.
Let's stay in this slow drift a little longer. We've talked about kitchens and feasts, about mistakes and memory, about lords and peasants alike. But there's one more thing to notice before we fully leave the medieval Christmas behind: the rhythm. Because medieval Christmas wasn't just a day, it was a cadence, a gentle pulse in an otherwise relentless year. It moved through weeks of preparation, a single day of feasting, and then the quiet aftermath that stretched until Candlemas. This rhythm mattered. Daily life in the Middle Ages was exhausting. Work was unending. Fields needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Bread needed baking. Firewood needed chopping. And yet, Christmas forced a pause. Even if it was small, even if it was imperfect, even if it was cold and drafty, people marked the time differently during this season. Hours were counted not only by work, but by light, by meals, by the act of preparing something special. The chopping, the boiling, the turning of the spit, the kneading of dough, all of it carried a quiet meaning. Every action contributed to the whole. Every detail mattered because of intention, not perfection. Children noticed the rhythm most vividly. They might wake to the smell of bread before dawn, the gentle hum of a fire, the clatter of pots and pans. They understood instinctively that something was different, that today was set apart. Adults experienced it differently. Their attention was on logistics, on planning, on making sure the day would be marked properly. And yet, amidst the smoke and the stress, there was a subtle reward, the comfort of tradition, the reassurance that this moment would pass and life would continue, and that it was okay. Even the preparation itself was soothing in a strange way. It gave structure to a harsh winter. It gave purpose to labor. It gave hope that warmth, light, and abundance, even briefly, were possible. And then came the feast. Quiet, measured, and deliberate. Not chaotic, not spectacular by modern standards, but satisfying. Every bite reminded people that effort mattered. Every shared portion reminded them that community mattered. Every cup of ale or wine reminded them that celebration, even restrained, mattered. And when the last crumbs were gone, when the fire faded and the hall fell silent, life returned to its usual pace. Work resumed. Winter pressed in. The challenges of survival remained. But something lingered. Memory, tradition, the knowledge that even in the bleakest days a pause was possible, that people could gather, that food could be prepared with care, that warmth, however temporary, could exist. And that's what medieval Christmas ultimately represents. Not extravagance, not spectacle, not perfection, but continuity, connection, the slow, steady acknowledgement that life goes on, and that sometimes the best we can do is mark the moment, share what we have, and then carry the feeling forward. So, as we finally drift away from kitchens and halls, from peasants' cottages and noble estates, from the burnt edges and dense breads, let's take a moment to appreciate that. The feast may end, the fires may die down, the ale may run out, but the rhythm remains. the quiet rhythm of medieval life, marked, however briefly, by Christmas. And with that, we can rest. Let the night settle fully. Let the memory of smoke, bread, and spiced pottage drift gently through the mind, and sleep slowly, comfortably, and with the sense that even centuries ago, people found ways to mark the passing of time, to care for each other, and to celebrate the little warmths they could.